Have you ever had someone cancel on you and it was sudden, and maybe initially you were a little bit surprised or disappointed, and then you thought to yourself, oh, I all of a sudden have free time, unplanned free time, and it feels great. Why is that? If you ever experienced that, it might give you the indication, I think I might be a little bit too busy if I'm feeling this good about a cancellation. Well, we have been studying the book When Church Stops Working, and in this devotional we're on chapter 2, Busy People, Busy Church, a Killer Cocktail. The book is written by Andrew Root and Blair Bertrand. On pages 19 through 20 in that chapter, the authors say that every church has an origin story. My church has one. In fact, it goes like this. In the 1960s, Grace Evangelical Congregational Church was located in the city of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and it was booming, over 1,000 people. In fact, people from far beyond the borders of Lancaster City were traveling into the city to attend Grace Church. And so the pastor, David Heil, and some of the other leaders had a vision for planting new churches in some of the communities where these people were coming from, one of which was this community just outside the city in East Lampeter Township of Conestoga Valley. And so in September of 1968, a new church was formed and had its first worship service in what was then the Locust Grove Mennonite School. That's how we began. Now, sadly, and maybe soberingly, our mother church no longer exists. By the early 2000s, they had actually dwindled to a point where they actually gave their building away to another local independent church with the promise that they could continue meeting there. And they did for about 15 years. And then in 2017, they merged with one of our sister churches in nearby East Petersburg. Churches not only have origin stories, they sometimes have death and dying stories. The authors of the book refer to Mars Hill Church in Seattle, and if you've listened to the Christianity Today podcast, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, you know what we're talking about. At its peak, it had 15,000 attenders, and then it imploded and no longer exists. So what these origin and death stories reveal is a few important points. The authors tell us that, first of all, we Americans tend to believe that bigger is better. I definitely feel that. Every Monday when I'm at my desk, I make a report to our leadership team with statistics. How much money was given, how many people attended, and my emotions can be very impacted by those statistics. I allow that to be true. If the statistics are low, I can feel down. If the statistics are normal or high, I can feel joy. But is bigger better? Well, not necessarily. The second key point that we learned is that not only is bigger not necessarily better, but many of us point to the origin story of the original church in the book of Acts, chapter 2. And we read in Acts chapter 2, verse 41, that after Peter preached his first sermon there in the city of Jerusalem, 3,000 people were added to their number. They started with 120. Can you imagine growing from 120 people to 3,120 overnight? Amazing. And we're very much drawn to that. Probably because we American Christians can be addicted to the idea of triumphalism. The authors talk about this in pages 21 and 22. Triumphalism is about triumph. Organizations, groups, nations experiencing victory and growth. Well, that's rooted in the idea that bigger is better. So we rarely hear stories about struggle, hardship, dying, and death, the authors tell us. For example, consider the book that Philip Jenkins wrote, The Lost History of Christianity. It details the story of what happened to the original Christian churches in the Middle East, and essentially they are no more. If you would go to visit some of the famous names of the New Testament, like Corinth or Ephesus, you're going to go visit archaeological sites. not Christian sites where churches are thriving. And so we need to hear the authors tell us what is the result of this, or the cause of this. Well, we need to, as we learned in chapter 1, remember that our thinking can be capitulated to secular thinking and ideology. For example, take a look at the title of the book of Acts. It's actually called the Acts of the Apostles. Well, the authors point out that's a misnomer at best and just deeply insufficient at worst. The title doesn't refer to anything divine, and yet it is the Holy Spirit who is the main actor, enlivening, guiding, leading, and moving the early church. You cannot miss the vibrant work of the Holy Spirit when you read the book of Acts. As the authors state, in Acts, God is the hero, and the church waits. Waiting. How do you feel about waiting? Tom Petty once sang that waiting is the hardest part. But the authors respond on page 23, waiting, as practiced by the disciples and advocated by us, is not inactive, it's responsive. God acts, we respond. And that's why, as they taught us in chapter 1, we need to be aware of the influence of the secular age on our hearts and minds. In fact, secularism has so permeated our thinking that it can blind us to God's action. The effect of secularism, the authors tell us, is to make it very easy for us to latch on to religion. Religion is the action of mankind, of all humanity. We do things, we perform rites and rituals and hold programs and events. And the result of all this doing for God is that so often we do not like to wait for God. The result is also that the authors tell us we fear, what if God doesn't show up? So they tell us we need to take a fresh look at the church's origin story. Rather than the Acts of the Apostles, it is the Acts of the Holy Spirit. The people of the early church, they tell us, only ever act in response to God's act. When my wife and I were missionaries in Kingston, Jamaica, one of the Jamaican Christians would always say this phrase, I want to be a zombie for God. And he meant well. A zombie is one who is singularly focused on eating human flesh and brains. That's all they can think about. He wanted to be passionate like that about God, following God, never wavering, never apathetic, never dissolving into sin. And I think his view has some merit, but God doesn't override human free will. Instead, God works in tandem with us. Think of a tandem bicycle, two people riding on the same bike, with God in the front, guiding, directing, energizing, and us following, also participating, pedaling. And so the authors illustrate how we American Christians can actually derail this principle of God and humans working together because we're so busy. There's a temptation to move faster and faster and faster, to always be doing things. And that has really impacted the church. Think about how many worship services we have every year. It's every week. It's multiple times a week. Think about all the other events and classes and groups that we have. It's a lot. But on the other hand, how much does all of that busyness compare to the amount of time we are in front of screens like our iPads and other devices? Well, the authors report that it's way less. No doubt, we spend way more time in front of screens. And so what do? We as a church believe that we need to respond with more programming, more activities. We try, the authors tell us, to smuggle God into all the activities of our lives, but the result is exhaustion. And so the authors surprise us when they say that slowing down is a good thing, but it is not sufficient in itself to solve the problem. Instead, we need to go back to Acts chapter 1, where we observe Jesus' command to his disciples, wait. You can't wait when you're busy. We need instead to have a posture of readiness. Jesus taught us that no one knows the day, the time, or the hour of the Son's return, and so therefore we need to be ready at all times. So what does that readiness look like? How do we even know if we're ready? The authors refer to the Old Testament matriarch Sarah in Genesis chapter 18. God came to her and promised that she would bear a son, an heir. Well, Sarah laughed because she was really old. This had to be a joke. Well, the authors argue that Sarah was not ready for God. She wasn't ready. Her laugh was a scornful laugh at God's promise. And so instead of believing in God, instead of being ready for God to work, she took matters into her own hands. Instead of just waiting, listening, watching for God to keep his promise, Sarah had her husband Abraham sleep with her handmaid Hagar, who then became pregnant. But this was not the heir God promised. Instead, it led to a whole host of trouble. What will it look like for us to wait on God? The authors conclude that becoming ready for that encounter with God does involve becoming less busy. And, more importantly, it focuses on experiences of resonance. But that's not an easy prescription to understand in day-to-day terms, they admit. Instead, we wait by entering a process of slowing down, making space for what will almost certainly be frustrating, maybe even confusing. They talk about that concept of resonance in chapter 1. They introduced it to us there. And they encourage us to wait, even if it goes against the grain of everything in our American secular culture. We wait for resonance with God, that sense that God is at work, and we can participate with it. Here's the thing though, how long is it going to take? We don't know. What will it sound like? We don't know. What will it feel like? We don't know. And so, as dissatisfying as this might come across, we wait because we trust that God is who he said he is, a relational, communicative God. And we can trust that we will know that resonance with God when it happens. But be assured of this. If we, like Sarah, take matters into our own hands, it's almost certain that we will not experience resonance with God. Because we won't care. We'll be so busy doing other things. So what will it look like for us to, yes, slow down, decrease the busyness, and wait?